Hey guys, I'm Victoria, and today we are going to do a book review of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This was a behemoth of a book, and I spent the entire month of July trying to read it. So this is actually the only book that I really completed in July. So I decided, you know what, since a wrap-up would be a silly idea at this point, it is a book review. And I'm sure that's going to happen to me again, because I know some months get way busier, or when I try to read a giant book like David Copperfield, this really did take me the entire month. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about David Copperfield. It's tough to review a classic because I know there's so many people that have read it, but there's also people that haven't read it. I'm going to be as non-spoilery as I possibly can. David Copperfield is a young boy who we follow him grow up into his middle age. And if you didn't know, David Copperfield is very autobiographical. A lot of the events of David Copperfield's life parallel the events of Charles Dickens' life. So to give you a little synopsis of his childhood, and where we start with David Copperfield. From a very young age, the adults in David Copperfield's life fail him in one way or the other. Either they pass away or they're arrested, and somehow he is left as an orphan, kind of on his own. So that's the background of David Copperfield. He sort of becomes a street urchin through a series of events, and we watch him actually be subjected to child labor, and he has to go to work instead of go to school, which is something that actually happened to Charles Dickens as well. And the story sort of unfolds from there. If you were in the Victorian era actually reading this book, you would have been reading it in installments, so like kind of chapter by chapter, and that's how you would have been fed this story. Every installment of the book is getting a little bit further and further into David Copperfield's life. David Copperfield starts from a tragic background and becomes sort of a self-made man in Victorian England. Let's talk about the characters in this book. The character development in this book is phenomenal. That's something Charles Dickens is just a master at. This is my third Charles Dickens book that I've read. I've also read A Christmas Carol and A Tale of Two Cities. I think A Tale of Two Cities might still be my favorite over this one, because of the plot. David Copperfield is a lot more character driven, I felt, than it was plot driven. So if that's something that you enjoy, you might actually prefer David Copperfield to some of his other works. One of the reasons the characters were so fun in this book is because they have sort of running lines and running jokes about the characters. So for example, a character will have sort of a catchphrase that comes back all throughout David Copperfield's knowing that character. The characters in this book also are really funny a lot of the times. They have really weird quirks, just like a real life person has really weird quirks. And you actually see them kind of carry their quirks all the way through their life and all the way through David Copperfield knowing them. So I thought it was really realistic that some of these characters stay very consistent, just like people in real life don't necessarily drop their bad habits or their weird habits or their weird way of speaking. You know, that kind of follows them throughout their whole life. In that sense, I felt like the character development in this book was the strongest element of it. As far as the writing style goes, if you are brand new to classics, this is probably not one to start with. If you've never read English Victorian literature before, you may be tripped up a little bit by the language. I've read a lot of British literature, and even I had some struggles going through this one. Charles Dickens is just very long-winded a lot of the time. Sometimes the dialogues would go on forever and ever and ever, and I had a hard time figuring out what are we actually talking about, because they're just talking and just words are just coming out of these characters, and it seems like they're not really saying anything. But you know, what they're saying could have been said in a sentence. But really we have like a page of it, particularly with certain characters. And if you've read the book, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Mr. Micawber is one of the most verbose characters, and that's kind of the joke. It's kind of like a running joke with him, is because he always kind of speaks around what he's trying to say, and is not very direct. And even David Copperfield notices that. So that's also part of the character development in this book. So yeah, writing style wise, if you are a beginner to classics in any way, I would not start with this one. Maybe Tale of Two Cities is a little shorter, and that one, or actually The Christmas Carol would be probably a fun, good introduction to Charles Dickens. David Copperfield himself is a really likable character. He is almost too perfect. I think because he's the hero of the story, and also it's very autobiographical. You know, David Copperfield is sort of portrayed as a little bit of a perfect character, which I had a little bit of a problem with. I mean, he definitely has his flaws here and there, but overall, you know, David Copperfield can sort of do no wrong in this book, which can get kind of old. The elements that I enjoyed in this book were Charles Dickens' characters just being so colorful and fun, and also the humor. He is hilarious. Some of the interactions between the characters, like I was snickering because they're funny. I didn't necessarily think of Charles Dickens as funny before this book, and I was really pleasantly surprised by that. However, I had two main problems with this book, which is why I didn't end up giving it 5 stars. It's definitely a solid 4-star read for me. The first problem is the way that women are depicted in this book. And you know what? I realize that it's a product of its time, and Charles Dickens is a man living in Victorian England, and he has his own sort of perceptions of women. You see this most clearly in David Copperfield's marital status and relationships throughout the book. To me, it seemed like the more feminine the character, the dumber they were. And that's part of something he complains about with his marriage. The woman that he ends up marrying is that she's, you know, so beautiful and sweet and emotional, but she's just not very smart. And he feels sort of unequal as a partner in this marriage because, you know, she can't keep up with him. And then there's this other character who's sort of the epitome of femininity and piousness and everything that he would want in a marriage. However, she's sort of unattainable and untouchable. Like, she's too perfect, so couldn't possibly think of her as a mate because she's too perfect. So that was kind of weird, I felt. And then if you've read the book and you kind of know what happens with his marriages as the book goes, you'll maybe get an idea of what I'm talking about as well. I was not happy with how this book ended in regards to marriage. And then on the other side, you have some more gruff women in his life who are a little more rough around the edges, but they're smarter. They're not as feminine, but they're smarter. So, you know, there's kind of a weird message there of femininity goes with unintelligence, and then, you know, the more manly a woman is, the smarter she is. Now, I'm sure that's not what he was really trying to say by any means, but it's what I picked up from just the time period and the way he was writing about the women. So if that annoys you in any way, you know, just be aware of that. That's in here. It's a product of its time. The second problem that I had with the book was its length, really, and just how we had pages and pages and pages of nothing really happening, very significant, but a lot of talking, a lot of dialogue, very confusing dialogue at times. This could have been a much shorter book, I think. However, you do have to remember that people were reading this in installments. It wasn't necessarily meant to be read all at once, so that's something to keep in mind. I certainly did not regret reading this book. It was worth it. It was worth the work. You know, Charles Dickens really makes you work hard, but in the end, I think it's worth it, and I can recommend this book highly. I gave this classic 4 out of 5 stars. Let me know down in the comments if you have any intention of reading this book, or maybe if you've read this book and you have any thoughts that were similar to me or different from me. I would love to talk to you guys about this book. I hope you enjoyed my non-spoilery review of David Copperfield, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.